How can I, as a game developer, incorporate new game design elements that break through the glass ceiling set by game devs of the past who previously had the financial advantages of compensation due to the novelty of gaming during their time throughout the 1990s? And also, why would you want your game to be a competitive masterpiece if the competitive viability of that game hardly boosts sales overall? Who cares? The ironic part about creating a competitive masterpiece that compares to StarCraft Brood War or Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne is that it requires some of the greatest attention to detail for the least amount of financial return. Hey everybody, what's going on? This is wilkyb, and in this video I'll be talking about a potential roadmap of game development that game developers in the genre of turn-based strategy might want to consider during the course of their game's development, or even before they start developing their game. There is a game that exists exclusively in my own mind that compares to the greatness of games like StarCraft Brood War and Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne that takes the form of a turn-based strategy game. In my opinion, games in the genre of turn-based strategy have never broken through the glass ceiling of complex gameplay that supports a truly competitive environment like that of StarCraft or Warcraft. Currently, the greatest game in the genre of turn-based strategy, apart from chess, is Advanced Wars, which, in my opinion, suffers from a lack of complexity with respect to supporting a competitive environment. What all of these games have in common, Warcraft, StarCraft, and Advanced Wars, is that they each have set the standard to which we compare games to today. And another thing that these games all have in common with each other is that they were developed throughout the 1990s over the course of about a decade, which during that decade was there a novelty around the games industry that was a big advantage to game developers of that time due to the lowered expectations of the consumer. Developers back then were able to set their flag upon their mound that they initially built with their game, and then to build up their mound into a small hill to which they set their flag on once again, and then eventually setting their flags for good on the metaphorical mountain of game development that has set the industry standard with titles like StarCraft Brood War and Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne. And I think StarCraft 2 is also somewhere on that mountain, but personally, I think Blizzard kind of mishandled the development of StarCraft 2 beyond like the year 2013. But anyways, StarCraft 2 is definitely on that mountain. So the stepping stones that used to exist with the consecutive releases of game titles, such as Warcraft 1, then evolving into Warcraft 2, and then, in my opinion, Blizzard went from Warcraft 2 to StarCraft 1, and then from StarCraft 1 they improved it to StarCraft Brood War, and then from Brood War they went to Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, and then from Reign of Chaos they went to the Frozen Throne. And so these stepping stones of game development no longer exist for companies in the modern age. The novelty of the games industry, which supported these game studios to concurrently produce the masterpieces that set the standard of today, that novelty no longer exists to the benefit of game developers today because the expectations of the consumer is so much higher. The industry standard in the genre of turn-based strategy games was not designed with competitive gameplay at the forefront like what it had been at the forefront of real-time strategy. I think the novelty of the era and expectations of the consumers of the 1990s were a large part of the conditions that allowed Blizzard to produce masterpieces like StarCraft Brood War and Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne. So these stepping stones that help successful franchises of the past are now fully submerged under the rising tide of expectations from the consumer. So one thing I'll add that separates games like StarCraft and Warcraft from Advanced Wars is that they were specifically designed with the intention of being able to support a competitive environment, which I think was special about the 1990s and the later half of the 90s. In my opinion, Blizzard actualized the limitations of Warcraft 2 as not being complex enough to support serious competitive gameplay. And so the following years then, StarCraft and StarCraft Brood War were developed to fill that degree of complexity that Warcraft 2 simply couldn't meet. And that's with respect to supporting a competitive environment. So, some relevant questions that I think are worth asking at this point to game developers is, how will you, as an indie developer, ascend the mountain of strategy game development to reach the same heights of complexity as your current competitors with games like StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3, or StarCraft Brood War, given that the consumer of today will not provide the benefit of the stepping stones that the early game studios had while developing their games throughout the novelty of the 1990s? How can I, as a game developer, incorporate new game design elements that break through the glass ceiling set by game devs of the past who previously had the financial advantages of compensation due to the novelty of gaming during their time throughout the 1990s? And also, why would you want your game to be a competitive masterpiece if the competitive viability of that game hardly boosts sales overall? Who cares? The ironic part about creating a competitive masterpiece that compares to StarCraft Brood War or Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne is that it requires some of the greatest attention to detail for the least amount of financial return, while also appealing to some of the most toxic people who will play your game. And then lastly here, and more practically, what is your plan B as a game developer when your masterpiece of a game begins to show its cracks upon further playtesting? At that point, you have to practically ask yourself, how can I release this game without losing time and money or damaging my reputation as a competitive game designer? And also it's worth considering at that point, what would you do differently next time so that you don't run into the same problems that require a system overhaul in order to maintain more competitive and balanced gameplay? So, the relief here that I can provide to you, game designers, is that you don't necessarily need to produce a masterpiece in order for your game to be financially successful. Wargroove is a great example of this, in my opinion. However, if you do wish to produce a masterpiece of a game, according to the vision that I have, then your game must be able to support a competitive environment, in my opinion. So, the practical roadmap that I would suggest to indie game developers is to start its development with 95% of the focus of your efforts on single player and campaign mode upon initial release. I would actually highly recommend that you considerably limit the multiplayer assets upon initial release, and then perhaps deliver a sequel that includes multiplayer assets, where then you can focus on the elements that create competitive gameplay. Imagine for a second now that chess never existed before, and you just invented and released chess on Steam. Chess has no story to it, and it has no campaign mode, and it's an incredibly complex and sophisticated game. In my opinion, a game like chess in the modern age would struggle very badly upon initial release with respect to financial sales and compensation, because it has no single-player assets like story mode. So, if you have a vision of a masterpiece of a competitive game, then you have to be certain that the new elements that you introduce to your game produces more complex gameplay than what your competitors currently provide. In some of my videos, I describe in great detail how I measure complexity of maps via mass production of replays, in Advanced Wars in particular, using the wilkyb standard of proof. You can refer to this video to understand what I mean when I say measuring the complexity of a map. In my opinion, any strategy game that has a competitive player base, In my opinion, any strategy game that has a competitive player base must have an internal team of designers who balance different elements of game design in-house. I do highly recommend to game developers that you do not solely rely on your community input to develop the aspects of your game, like map design and co-balancing. I recommend that you keep your communication with your target audience quite low. The reason for this being that the more you communicate with the masses about what your game will be, then the greater risk you have in disappointing your audience with something that they expect than what is different than what you actually deliver. Also, if you are a turn-based strategy game developer with the intention of supporting a competitive environment around your game, and your user base are just simply re-uploading the competitive maps of Advance Wars by Web or Wargroove or whatever other game it is, if they're simply just re-uploading these competitive maps from a different game now onto your game, then you've probably done something wrong with respect to producing a masterpiece. The glass ceiling of this genre is the Advance Wars by Web map committee. The elephant in the room around map design across this entire genre is that the Advance Wars by Web map committee have the greatest influence across this entire genre, and they're just not that great at making maps that appeal to the elite level of players. If you want more of my input about this, then there are videos of mine that you can watch, like this one here, or you can message me personally and we can talk more about that. So I'm not saying that you should ignore the map committee altogether, because they are very scientific about their own maps and methods that you can learn from, but they are really bad at recognizing significant map design that goes beyond the scope, their own scope of map making. The map committee is notoriously allergic to replay analysis. The meta of competitive turn-based strategy hasn't changed for 15 years. The competitive meta across this genre is to produce maps with full vision on. And this is just a terrible limitation, in my opinion, and I can prove that. It's not just an opinion. The terrible limitation is that the Advance Wars by Web map committee designs this game around full vision. And they're not willing to wrap their heads around the complexity that Fog of War can provide to maps, given that they're made in a different way than the rule set that they have provided. So, a similar thing, like I have just mentioned with map design, is also true for balancing gameplay elements like within a hero editor or a commanding officer creator. In my opinion, turn-based strategy should be balanced around map design first, and co-powers and co-balancing is just the garnish to gameplay that already exists on the board. So, anyways, that's all I have to say about this topic right now. To wrap things up here, I think that in order to produce a masterpiece of a turn-based strategy game, then it must be complex enough to support competitive gameplay. In order for your game to be financially successful, then you will have to focus on the single-player assets like campaign and story mode primarily. And also, just as an indicator, is that if you have a competitive audience who are just re-uploading maps from other games onto your game, then you're probably doing something wrong with respect to producing a masterpiece. So, you don't have to produce a masterpiece. I'm not saying that as a game developer that is your initial intention, truly. Of course it is, because you want to produce the best thing you possibly can. But I think at some point, there are limitations that you'll run into as a game developer, as you've currently been developing your game, according to the advice that you've gotten from, the community writ large. And the community writ large are heavily influenced by the Advance Wars by Web map committee. And they play maps with full vision on, and I think that is a seriously questionable limitation. So, anyways, you should get more advice from more people, and yeah, that's all I have to say about that right now. Okay, guys? So, if you like this video, you can like and subscribe, and you can also join the Discord with a link below. Okay? Thank you. Adios.